Hi, welcome to Morning Talk Show. Today, my conversation with Mark Vernon. Mark first came to my attention as a collaborator and friend of Rupert Sheldrake, who I'm a huge fan of. But Mark has a lot of great insights and a lot of great online content that can be found. He also wrote a book called The Secret History of Christianity, Jesus, the Last Inkling, and the Evolution of Consciousness. And it's a long title. The book is really, really good. I read it, and it's basically Mark's distillation of the thoughts of, or the views of Owen Barfield, who was a friend of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. But I recommend the book and this podcast interview, regardless of whether you've heard of Mark Vernon or regardless of whether you've heard of Owen Barfield, because Barfield's general, like the very short form of what Barfield had to say was that consciousness evolves, and he has Mark presents a history of basically consciousness from early days. I mean, he doesn't really get into prehistoric man, but from the earliest writings and the philosophers up to Jesus and beyond Jesus to the Reformation and beyond that. And it's really, really interesting because it shows why ancient writings were so different than today and how ancient people really viewed themselves and the world in a fundamentally different way than we do today. And then it also shows how the arrival of Jesus and the writings in the Bible were perfectly timed to kind of capture and codify a shift in consciousness that was happening. So we get into that in the interview, and the book is definitely worth a read. And Mark Vernon just is a fascinating guy. So I hope you like it. I enjoyed it very much. I hope to talk to Mark again. And without more rambling from me, here's my conversation with Mark Vernon on Morning Talk Show. Mark Vernon, welcome to Morning Talk Show.
Thank you very much for having me on. Nice to join you.
You are one of those people, I don't know if you have this, where you come across someone and you're not quite primed for them yet. So I was aware of you maybe a year ago when I was looking into Rupert Sheldrake and listening to your dialogues with Rupert Sheldrake. And at the time, I was all doe eyes for Sheldrake, and as many people are, because he's quite he's a deep well himself. And then, lo and behold, later, I come across your site and your Owen Barfield, your short videos about Owen Barfield, and all of a sudden, I got really excited about what you had to say and all of the ideas and things that you bring together in your, in your work. So just a broad question, how do you describe yourself and your work when people ask? Unless that's too broad, no pressure.
Yeah, no, well, it is evolving. I mean, you mentioned Rupert, and I remember discovering Rupert, and apart from what he said, which I found intrinsically interesting, I was also, I think, inspired by his courageousness, really. I find him a very courageous thinker, very open. And it was as much the spirit he says things in. You know, he's kind of prepared to go wherever he feels the evidence and his experience of life is leading. And I found that hugely liberating. And so learned a lot from him. And in a way, I've been trying to follow my own path in that way too, in that same spirit. And Barfield, who you mentioned there, has been key. Partly quite practical stuff. I mean, I did this PhD on Plato. And whilst I ended up getting the PhD, all right, and you know, grappling with Plato during that time, but I felt I never really understood what Plato was on about, even though I got this PhD. And it wasn't until I started reading Barfield that I began to get a sense of what might really be going on. You know, similarly, I had this kind of background with Christianity, which has had its ups and downs, and it's only really since Barfield that I've begun to make some sense of that.
Yeah, I laugh because I can relate to that in such a major way. Keep going.
Yeah. Well, so it's an ongoing process, but I guess, you know, I feel like I'm pretty settled at the moment, feeling that inner life is what, you know, we're not so good at, say, in modern culture, certainly in the West. And also for a psychotherapy training and working as a psychotherapist. So trying to bring all these things together and kind of offer whatever I can in a way, as well as keeping working on myself to develop this side of life. Because I think it, one way or another, I think it underlines both a lot of our problems, but also can carry us a huge long way as well. So I don't know, yeah, general in response, but
no, that's great. And
I know that.
And one of the things that I appreciate, that I hope you appreciate, is unusual about that is the kind of casual way in which you say you did a PhD on Plato and you didn't know what he was on about. Like that kind of ability to hold your own knowledge loosely, I think is part of cultivating that inner life and making it less restrictive. I was actually, just as I was preparing for this, I was watching a video where I think you might be familiar with Tim Freak, or maybe you've heard of Tim Freak.
Yeah, I certainly know of him. Yeah,
he was on my on the podcast as well, and he just released a video saying he's been wrong about consciousness being the ground of reality, or he's just, and he kind of seemed excited to say that, and I think that's kind of one of those really important things that. While we get somebody like Rupert isn't bound by what he thinks people's response to his ideas will be, he hopefully, and you, aren't bound by what you have, how you have imagined yourself in the past. That's really good and really healthy.
I mean, you have to work at it. It's not, I think you have to become conscious of how you police yourself and all those kind of things, and it's a constant process of discernment as well. Nonetheless, as long as you feel there's a general momentum of expansion, and I'm very keen on the word freedom, the idea that it's a kind of freedom that's not just any old thing, but it's a kind of freedom that where you sense that you're coming closer to the way things are, that at the same time feels freeing. It's that sort of, I don't know, like an inner kind of, not quite a moral compass, but some kind of compass. I try to keep a check on.
I feel like we're birds in many cages, and freedom is maybe something we move towards while letting our definition of freedom evolve at the same time. So I found lots of freeing things in your book, which I just finished the audiobook yesterday, so hopefully it's all fresh in my mind. And as I mentioned in my email, normally I reach out really quickly when I discover someone, and I talk to them almost like as fresh as I can. So having read your whole book, it's really interesting. I feel a bit of pressure to sound like I understood it, but so the book. Can you describe the current book and your purpose for writing it?
Yeah, so this is the book, A Secret History of Christianity, and the subtitle is Jesus, the Last Inkling, and the Evolution of Consciousness.
That's the part I can't remember is the subtitle usually. Anyway, Jesus, the Last Inkling, and the Evolution of Consciousness. Okay, go ahead.
So the Last Inkling refers to Barfield. He's often referred to as the Last Inkling because he was in the first group of this Oxford gaggle that included Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And then he outlived them all, dying in 1997. And it was my attempt, having engaged with Barfield and got tremendously interested and excited by what he was saying, to tell the story of Christianity through his insights. And in a way, see how much they stacked up still too. So I did quite a lot of work on the biblical scholarship, the ancient history, to see whether his line of interpretation, it's not, Christianity is many, many things, so it's never going to encompass them all, and it would be foolish to think it would. But I wanted to find out whether there was at least a kind of a core, strong current of scholarship from other areas that could be used to support his ideas. Because, one of his ideas is that something tangible is unfolding in history, even as it's also got huge spiritual significance. So you have to kind of at least make a good enough case that it does land somewhere in the real world. So if I'd done the work and found that the historical Jesus insofar as that figure can be known at all, just looked like nothing Barfield had ever said, then that would be a problem. But actually, it made a lot more sense to me. So the book is, in a way, that it's also, I hope it's a kind of a way of engaging with Christianity, particularly perhaps for those who feel that a lot of mainstream Christianity doesn't quite catch it for them, but they don't want to go the complete demythologization route as well. They find that emptying of the meaning of it. So he kind of represents a third way for me too, to try and make sense of this great past I've got with Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's very relatable. And I think that the demythologizing route is, it's become kind of a default, I think, in the way people talk. And I've been in a period of spiritual upheaval for a couple years now, to the point that I actually really enjoy it now. And things like your book, are like confirming of that. But at a certain point, I just assumed that, well, here comes atheism. You know what I mean? Like, here comes complete scientific materialism. And I almost was like, well, like you feel like you're by the exit door of a religion, and everybody's over here in the religion. You're like, okay, guys, I'm gonna go out. Do you want me to close the door, or and you don't want to go out, you don't want to stay in. And so, this book is really, really interesting to me in that way. The requirement, I've started to feel like it's not any particular idea. It's the requirement of that idea, or the fostering or the enforcement of an idea, because scientific materialism is a state of thinking that we probably needed at a certain point to kind of clear out some things, and to demystify some things, and to sort of make this more concrete view of reality after original participation, to really explore it. But it doesn't need to be a perpetual state. It's the enforcement of that. I don't know if that resonates with you.
Yeah, no, I mean, on the engagement with science, my first undergraduate degree actually was a physics degree. And I was lucky there because my tutor was always one of these physicists that had an expansive imagination rather than wanting to close things down. He actually has spent his whole career working on dark matter for like 40 or more years now, and still doesn't know whether it even really exists. So that's kind of what it's like working in real physics. So, I think a lot of physicists hold a lot more lightly what in the public domain seems really robust scientific materialism. So although I never quite, I couldn't really ever say I was an atheist, but I certainly had quite a strong agnostic phase, where I, suspected that religion was, supernatural nonsense, if you like. But then every time I went into a cathedral or heard a bit of religious music, I would think, but wait a minute, this sounds like nothing greater has ever been expressed or captured in stone.
Yeah,
so it seems
exactly.
a bit odd. At the same time, we say this is the gross emptiness of human life.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of tension that kept me just from flinging it all off. But I also get the kind of leaving the group behind, because I do think that a lot of the Christianity I know anyway, and particularly the Church of England, I can't really share it with many people that go to church. It seems too narrow, and the ecclesiastical constraints just seem fixated on themselves to me. So, I get why that happens. That's what happens in groups. But there's a kind of loneliness to it as well as, frustration and anger as well at times.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there's a dissonance that is present even up to the most staunch, vocal, members of those groups. There's a kind of a mania, that it is that they're suffering from. But I also don't want to be the person who accuses everyone in those situations of being that way. Like, I really think Christianity gave me a language, an internal language that has served me at every point in my life. Even in high school, I remember someone saying religion was illogical, and I got, at that time I would have been very into destroying them, and that kind of thing. And in my mind, I was like, but no, like I didn't know about the idea, or that I think of now as internal logic. Whereas like there is something here. There's an internal logic. It's deeper. And like as soon as I tried to explain it, it was like it all fell apart. But yeah, there's something going on there. And there are many people deep within every sect of Christianity and many other religions who they've found enough of a kernel of that transcendent truth that they're happy to be there and work in that work. So I don't want to diss anyone, like, but yeah, but I'm more in line with what you're saying. So one of the things I wanted to say about your book before we get deep into the conversation is that I felt that you didn't need to be a Barfieldian to read it. And so, like, based on the title, I already recommended it to a friend, and he's like, I've never heard of Owen Barfield. And I was like, no, really, you don't have to be a fan of Owen Barfield or have heard of him. So I guess it's not a quibble, but it's one of those things that I hope people don't not read it because they're like, oh, I don't know who Owen Barfield is. Because what it seemed to me is a really well written history of basically of philosophy and Christianity that goes from pre-Christianity and the early philosophers up to the present day, and really frames how our thinking about every single thing has changed. So
Yeah.
it's not a question.
One of the reasons I like Barfield's is because I think he saw himself kind of in the service of greater ideas, greater unfoldings, life itself, reality itself, and both for himself, but also for others, trying to open up how that's deeper, and particularly with this idea of the evolution of consciousness. As you say, for him, Christianity begins about 1,000 years before Christ, because that's when things start to pick up some sort of momentum, of which the figure of Christ is a kind of culmination or a pivot point, kind of crystallizes what's been unfolding and then launches it into what we call Christianity. And then you've got the scientific bit, which is throwing it into question again, 1,500 years later. But and so he, the book, he's kind of like the presiding spirit or the guide, rather than it really being about him per se.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and because I was listening to the audiobook, I wasn't sure if there were ever parts that were quotations or like you didn't actually even bring Barfield's name into it a ton. So I was the lion's share of it was your interpretation of Barfield, like putting it into your own words.
Yeah. I hoped in the audiobook, when it was Barfield quote, it was pretty clear. So, but they were quite rare. Partly because part of the reason why Barfield's not so well known is he's not like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien in the sense that he's not nearly such a clear, brilliant writer. He's the kind of writer you wrestle with, but he reveals in the wrestling. Yeah. So that's the joy. But I did want to try and put across for people that have some, even if it's quite light notion of Christianity. It doesn't really mean much more than knowing that it exists, but could kind of get into the inner story what this might be about and why it might become so culturally significant.
Mm-hmm. And you can see the book made it really clear that Jesus lived at a very crucial period in history, and rather than being this force that took a bunch of loose threads of history and forced them together, which really doesn't jive with any of his character that you see when you read the Bible. He was more like he stood there as things, as the stampedes, collided, and was the flashpoint, just kind of nudged a few things here and there to kind of. I almost think of Jesus as standing in the in the pinch point of infinity, the infinity symbol, and that it went and then back out. And so it's nice because you don't again, there's no requirement of belief that Jesus was the Son of God to read this book and say, okay, like something significant happened here. And maybe you never move on to, okay, now I recite the Apostles' Creed, and now I hold the modern view of Christian salvation. But it's really, the book can still change your perception and leave this really, I would say, hopeful kind of vision of the future as something where change can actually happen, in human beings.
Yeah, no, I mean, Barfield was quite clear that nothing stops. Everything is continually moving for good and ill.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, he actually wrote a very nice essay where he said that if he'd never heard of Christianity, he would have presumed from his study of words that something pivotal happened at about 0 AD, plus or minus a few years, a few decades. And the reason was because by tracing the history of words and the way they change meaning, he felt you could track how human awareness, human experience changes. And so, for example, free will, which we now think is essential to what it is to be human, doesn't actually really get discussed until the 1st century AD, when it kind of takes off. So you think, so what happened to bring in this notion, and why didn't it really exist before? And so, yeah, he, through his study of words, which I also like Buffett because he has got evidence, this isn't just him kind of dreaming it up. Although he wouldn't have been down on dreaming things up, actually. But nonetheless, he, kind of, it's through tangible, hard study that I think hasn't been refuted, actually. It's very unfashionable history he does, because most history these days is just what happened next. And historians don't like reading any more into it. But nonetheless, he's the historian that sees something, deeper patterns unfolding. So he said he would have believed in a sort of ersatz Christianity, even if he hadn't heard of Christianity.
Right. That's really interesting. Yeah, and the idea of words, being having a soul, I think, is the way he puts it. Right, and that's I guess that's sort of like one of those ideas that's akin to Rupert Sheldrake's "The Sun is Conscious," where it's like all of the evidence that he's seeing in the real world in this mighty intuition that he has, Sheldrake and Barfield, that this is that the abstraction that takes place in his head, the blocks get stacked up, and that's where you end up. And I don't think, I mean, that's an issue of faith to me, to say that words have a soul, or to say that the sun is conscious. But what it says to me when someone says a statement so bold is that there's a path here, there's something here, there's more, there's I can follow this, and I don't have to get all the way to the idea that words are conscious. So would you say you believe that or not conscious words, that words have a soul? Would you say you believe that words have a soul?
Oh yeah. Or maybe not a soul, but they certainly transmit soul. That's why they have meaning. If you're a physicist, words are just vibrations in the air. If you're a linguist, they have certain kind of shape and function. But we actually hear meaning in words. Life worlds, as it were, are brought to us. That's why you can read poetry, or you can read fiction, or even prose. So they definitely transmit life to us. And I think that's all that soul means. Right. It has an inner animating quality.
Well,
Maybe just to say, just on Rupert and the sun being conscious, I actually think this is Rupert having a bit of fun in a way.
I think so too.
He's quite a witty writer, actually, in his own way. And basically what he's doing is he's saying, look, this panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is somehow embedded and part and parcel of the material world of matter. If that's so, then the sun is a very large assembly of matter doing all sorts of complex and sophisticated things. So wouldn't that be a kind of an emergent consciousness, at least? If, the reason why you like the idea that matter has some kind of embedded consciousness, because when it gets so complicated in your brain, it actually produces consciousness. So I think he's kind of like seeing how far that argument will run and challenging people.
I
But
like
I
that.
think Barfield's idea was quite different, actually. That if you like, for him, he's of the more Neoplatonic view that matter is a kind of reflection or an abstraction of consciousness. It's more idealism than panpsychism, to use the sort of technical philosophical words. So, in that view, well, in the Platonic view, there is the kind of aboriginal one, which is pure consciousness, if you like, or even beyond consciousness. And then because part of its inner dynamic is already to flow out, to emanate, to unfold, this naturally happens,
the
and
logos.
sort of it ripples out, if you like, which produces creation, and then matter is one sort of product of this unfolding consciousness.
Right.
So it's not the matter itself carries consciousness, but like everything else in the cosmos, it reflects consciousness. Right. It's more that kind of idea.
Right. And I mean, so many ideas, and that just shows how the idea of words with a soul illustrates that we don't live in a materialist world. Like even the most staunch materialist, couldn't even move without meaning and without this sort of overlay that people can describe as spiritual, and that word is prohibitive to some people, but it is like, there is a non-physical overlay. There is a creative process that goes into, if not creating the world, interpreting the world to the point that you can even take a single step or think a single thought. I liked in the book where you said, and I have it here, hold on. Music. It's about music.
Yeah.
Music should be musicality must be approached musically, not acoustically, and spirituality must be processed spiritually, which is interesting. And I wonder if I wonder if some of the words might be, or like spirituality might be tainted, but that concept is strong.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, I know the word spiritual and spirituality is tricky, and some people just hate it, and it's used in all sorts of ways. But I don't know. I was involved with a project actually, which ended up being called Spiritualize, and we spent hours debating the S word, and just figured that at the end of the day, you have to kind of live with it, because it does capture something that is certainly not the material aspect of life, but it's more than just the emotional and psychological as well. Yeah. And if you're reaching for that, then you have to go for it. But yeah, no, the thoughts on music, this is actually one of the points where C.S. Lewis and Barfield come close together. That Lewis wrote this essay, or I think it was a sermon actually originally, and it's now been published as an essay called Transposition. And his idea was that precisely that much like, I don't know, when you look at a picture, you don't just see sort of, as it were, colour on the surface of the paper or lines on the surface of the paper. You see an image, and that's because you bring something to the picture that can interpret the image. So when you hear the notes of a piece of music, you bring something to those notes to hear the music. Yeah. And so the question is then, where does that come from? And again, you can, I suppose, make a kind of materialist argument for that, but it seems much more natural, given the actual experience that music can have upon us, to presume that it's channeling a whole lot more. And that's why we love it, and it takes us elsewhere, and it gives us transcendent, numinous feelings, as well as everything else that it can do. Yeah, and it has, in the experience of art, it's something we don't necessarily acknowledge, is that there's a creative element to our participation in art. I think, and the participation with that is, well, I mean, the participation is one of the things that makes it art, rather than just a tool of information or something like that. Yeah. So an AI doesn't participate in life, even though it might seem to. It's just replicating something. Yeah. Where we, I think we only know anything at all, actually, to the extent that we participate in it, that it becomes part of our being. Yeah. So it's a very core feature of our lives. As you were speaking, as I was listening to your book,
you got into where you were talking about imagination, and Barfield felt that imagination was crucial. And there's kind of this little cohort that I discovered in my online travels with, like, is it Malcolm Guite, in Coleridge, and like basically the examination of the romantic period of really, kind of using words to using the soul of words in poetry and that kind of thing. And so as I was hearing this, I was trying to, the thought came to my mind of creation, the act of creation, as one of our six senses, or as a sixth sense. And then sure enough, you said that.
Oh, right.
You said it, but like chapters later, and it was very interesting because I was, I was quibbling in my mind, not with the concept of imagination as a crucial tool and as something that is a part of every experience of reality, because I'm fully on board with that. Like I'm an artist, and I'm a person who writes music and lyrics, and so that was immediately evident to me. But then I was a little bit worried that, because I think there's some things in this book that are so important that speak so well to our time right now. They're not this time capsule of thought from the Inklings era, that I was a little bit worried that idea of imagination was going to be a stopping point for a lot of people who don't consider themselves imaginative. And then, so it kind of crystallized actually in the idea of creativity as a sixth sense to me. So forgive me if this is wordy. I kind of structure these as conversations where both people explore ideas. So I really don't want to seem like someone who just loves the sound of my own voice. I'm engaging with your ideas.
No, sure, yeah, no. This is the imaginative act. This very conversation is precisely what imagination is. It's searching and feeling and trying to find the right word or the right image. That is exactly what takes us into reality.
Yeah, which is so interesting, because that's what this podcast is for me, as an act of creation, or an act of imagination. But I don't know if it falls into the categories that people would call imagination or call creativity, because it seems like just a conversation. But what was fascinating to me about this whole concept of creativity as a sense is that it's a participatory sense in a way that nothing else is. In other words, if in hearing something, the heard became a part of the hearer, that would be the corollary. If you tried to sort of say, if you tried to compare creation as a sense to the other senses, it would be like, if I'm using this sense to sense something, that is actually a part of me as well. So for me, I can look at Mark Vernon on the screen in England, and with my sense of sight, at least with the way that I have portrayed my sense of sight for my whole life, I am identifying something outside myself, very far outside myself, in every way that you can be separate. Whereas in a conversation with Mark Vernon, you are a part of me. You know what I mean? Because the creative element and the imaginative element of the conversation is actually, I'm kind of creating Mark Vernon, and I'm using the data I'm using the information that's coming in, but that information, when the spirit is there or whatever, that information that's coming in actually is coming in from my spirit from my sense of creation. Does that make sense, or am I being too hippy dippy?
No. I mean, see, again, I think that we do this all day, every day, but we don't quite realize it's one of these things that's so close to us that we hardly notice it. But you do notice it, for example, in psychotherapy, because when someone comes to you with a trouble, very often it's to do with things that have happened, now or in the past. But it's as much how what's going on is interpreted that's causing the real life, sometimes life destroying trouble. And so how we interpret things, how we experience it, what we take to an experience as well as take from an experience, all this goes on in this imaginative domain. And it may be fantasy, it may be foolish, it may be all those as well. But in this romantic tradition of which Barfield's a part, particularly stemming from Coleridge, they develop ways of discerning what is imagination actually, as it were, connects with reality beyond yourself, as opposed to just your own fabrications. But yeah, and another really key figure is William Blake, who too, I think, developed really quite actually a complex system that's kind of buried in his poetry, because he wants you to wrestle with it in order to really see it and feel it.
Right.
But yeah, because we've we're so dominated by machine metaphors for who we are now, that we've almost lost touch with what nonetheless is going on all day and every day. Yeah,
it's true. And while I don't disagree with anything you just said, the word interpretation has been a sticking point. You know what I mean? Like, because it turns my experience of Mark Vernon into a scientific experience where I say, okay, now I have formed Mark in my mind, and there's now a dividing line. So everything that he confirms with data moves over into just reality, and everything that he disconfirms moves over into incorrect. So there's no liminal space there. There's no Holy Spirit, as I think of it, which is that's a term that also needs a ton of unpacking. There's nothing in the middle there that says that there's a real life in my imagination of you, or there's a real life in my imagination. So that's actually why I feel like that you saying creativity as a sixth sense is important, because it actually creates this Holy Spirit between the I don't know, between like what my abstraction of you, or between like the reality of you and the ground of what you really are. There's this other thing that's useful to me as the perceiver.
Well, again, there's nothing actually that novel about this idea, even if it feels novel. Because data is only what you've abstracted from reality. And the way you abstract it from reality is by how you interpret reality.
Yeah.
So you need, as it were, an imagination of atomism before you can see atoms. Reality does not sit around with labels saying this is an atom. Any more than in your brain, the brain sits around with a region saying this is where you see things and this is where you smell things.
Yeah.
You have to have models that you take to what you're investigating, and those models are generated imaginatively. This is really self-evident in physics. I think a lot of the struggle that people have is that that biology tends to dominate people's sense of what's scientific and what's not. And the thing about biology is it's had this incredible success with the evolution of Darwinian evolution, that is a hugely imaginative undertaking that Darwin took to the natural world, and then others have developed since. And it makes sense. It joins so many dots, but it's very dominant in biology. Whereas in physics, physics has always known that it's different approaches to reality are mutually incompatible. So relativity on the one hand is completely mutually incompatible with quantum theory. One is deterministic, one is random, seemingly. So physicists always know that what you take reveals what you see.
Yeah.
And you're definitely seeing something, otherwise we'd all be mad and crazy and wouldn't be able to speak or communicate in any way at all.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be able to use science to make technology, wouldn't be able to use arts to find meaning.
Yeah.
But we're always, looking at reality through these layers. But to speak to your point about co-creativity, that also is part of our freedom, because that invites us to make more and more and more of reality, which I think is ultimately to participate in the kind of divine creativity, which is this continual expansion and unfolding. We're, picking up a new thread and seeing where that leads you and amplifying that. And you know, if it makes you feel a bit nervous, you know, where's reality? The upside is that there's always more and more of reality to expand and co-create,
right?
Because of the way that it actually works.
Yeah, I mean, which might be terrifying to some people, but I think there's something in the air. There's something in the consciousness right now that is making this idea of a wide open, future of expanding reality is making it more appealing. If you consider things like Joe Rogan having physicists onto his show, and a lot of people, I mean, which probably annoys physicists to no end, there are a lot of people out there who are discussing, certain things, quantum physics and that kind of thing, who really know the like sort of narrative talking points of it, like the two slit experiment or whatever, and that kind of thing. And the first time Joe Rogan had, I can't remember the name of the physicist, but there's a physicist that he has on regularly, and it's clear that even like Joe doesn't get it, and he'll admit it. He's like, I've read this book, and I still don't really get it. But is there something so compelling? I think it is maybe what you're describing, where there's this science that actually does involve a certain amount of faith and a certain amount of creativity and imagination and acceptance of the fact that you might be spinning your wheels in search of truth that we haven't accessed yet, or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think physicists, there's a secret that every physicist hides, which is that they actually take their models of reality and then go and find the maths that can formalize the theory and then turn it into experiments to test the formalisms.
Yeah.
But, you know, the holographic universe, that didn't come sort of spring spontaneously out of looking at atoms. That came because a few physicists thought, look, holograms where the whole is contained in all the parts. Maybe that's a good model for the cosmos. And then they go and then their genius is that they can turn that into mathematical formalisms. And that is immensely complicated. I mean, I did in undergraduate physics degree, we sort of tiptoed towards the Schrodinger equation once or twice, and that was about it. Doing no more than that. So there's real expertise there, don't get me wrong. But the bigger picture stuff, it is quite widely shared, actually. You know, that reality might be random at base, or if you like Einstein, that reality is deterministic at base. There's sort of, I don't know, half a dozen models or so that do the rounds in physics. And we can have access to those with a bit of thought. The mistake I think people make is they then think that somehow quantum physics shows that this is the case or that's the case. Right. It's actually the other way around, that people's intuitions or deeply worked out experience or philosophy of reality is taken to the quantum physics.
Right. We do have a feeling of wanting to jump into certainties, and if you realize the ground you're standing on isn't a certainty to you anymore, you want to jump to another certainty, which is why somebody like Rupert Sheldrake kind of comes smirking into the equation and sort of, says, well, what about this? And, so
That's very good. That's very good.
Well, thank you. No, oh man, there was a time where my whole sort of online life was listening to the voice of Rupert Sheldrake and Ian McGilchrist. And I'm amazed that I didn't fall asleep, because those two men have these beautiful resonant voices. They're also both, incidentally, people who are on my dream list to talk to. But anyway, so I guess I when I hear your book, there's original participation, and then we move into the original participation, in which kind of there isn't a strong sense of in the individual, and then we move into what was it called? Is it reciprocal, or what?
Yeah. So there's a kind of withdrawal of participation where we feel alienated and have to struggle and wrestle with things, and then Barfield call it? Well, he actually more commonly calls it in his books final participation, in fact, but he does sometimes refer to it as reciprocal participation. And I went for that because I felt it was a bit clearer, because he meant final, not as in the end, but final as in the direction, the telos. But that's not so commonly, that's not the way the word's used very much now. So reciprocal, though, means that basically, you know, our inner life reflects outer life. And so we feel a participation, we feel that's at once deep and true and connected, but also is free, so we can maneuver around. And that's the great advantage of the alienating phase. You know, it's very common in spiritual traditions where struggle actually gives birth to enlightenment. And there's no enlightenment without the struggle. You know, there's no death without resurrection, would be the Christian way of putting it.
Absolutely.
And so it's seeing that in operation.
And I think when you see the phases of human cognition or of consciousness as laid out in the book, I mean, they map onto my personal experience of life within my lifespan. You know what I mean? Like the infant, you know, experiencing their mother is original participation, and then you go into this period of learning in which you get disillusioned and you get a lot of injuries while you're testing out things like physics, and then there's this period. Like then you develop a sense of yourself, you know, and you separate your identity from your parent. And then you go into this period of adolescence, which if I were to sort of add my own terminology there, I would say the Reformation feels like consciousness's adolescence, where now, and the book isn't, I wouldn't say you're very glowing. There were a couple attempts to kind of say, and this was important, you know, but in general, the Reformation felt to me like the movement that was like, well, it was like when, it's like when you try and fully define your sense of yourself, and you sort of are saying, I am this, you know, I'm a punk. I dress like a punk. I listen to punk music, and those who don't listen to punk music are not punks. You know what I mean? And like it's this process of necessary process of kind of self-consciously defining yourself. And that does that resonate with you? What I'm saying about the Reformation?
Yeah, no. I mean, it's necessary. The descent is necessary before the ascent, because you have to be able to detach yourself in order to become freer. But then you don't just want to remain independent, you want to become interdependent. I mean, there are parallels, I think, with developmental cycles in the human lifespan, you know, like from infancy through adolescence and so on, as you're saying. But actually, I think original participation back in history, say with Aboriginal people, Barfield wasn't calling them infants in consciousness. What he was saying was that it was a completely different consciousness. It has its own sophistication and its own complexities. You know, if you read ancient mythology, it's quite clear that it's got wisdom, complexity, nuance. You know, it's quite as sophisticated as what we tell ourselves now. But it's a different way of navigating through life. And in particular, it's this, you know, the ancient people don't ask, is there meaning? They're flooded with meaning, and they have to find their way through that meaning. And finding their way through that meaning is quite as sophisticated and adult, if you like, mature. You know, nothing lasts unless it matures. And these systems in various parts of the world lasted for centuries, millennia. So with that one really important proviso, actually, because Barfield's also not a linear thinker. You know, he's not like some developmentalists these days that feel the consciousness just kind of gets better and better and more sophisticated, more integrated, whatever. He's not like that at all. He's much more a kind of alienation and return thinker. The U shape was his favorite shape. So that we fall away from one consciousness, but by reflecting both on what we've lost and where we might be headed, we gain a new one. So that's much more the shape of things for him.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for the record, I'm not making a value judgment about infancy at all. I actually have a huge respect for infants and the things that they do and learn. So I guess, it could be seen as what I just said was implying that these early civilizations and stuff were, and early humans were we're infantile, but that's not at all what I mean. I guess I'm just but I did bring a value judgment into adolescence. So so yeah,
it's all necessary.
It's not a perfect. Yeah, it is, and there's a real dogmatism to a 13-year-old's mind, which is an interesting thing. But I do like this idea that you're talking about with the U shape, with disillusion and return. And I think, it would be really difficult. It would take a lot of effort to espouse the worldview that consciousness gets better and better, because we look around at what we have now and what we accomplish now compared to what people accomplished in the past, and I don't think you can say it's better. Certainly our robotics are superior to that of the ancient Egyptians now, but like that, like in general, that's one of the things that has been difficult for me, is that I have been had this intuition that we actually need a next phase of evolution of consciousness, but at the same time, my picture of my picture of of human beings evolving as a species would be more like, okay, it's Star Trek time, and now we've all come to this conclusion that yes, we're going to be, we're going to be peaceful, and we're going to have, we're all going to wear the same clothes, and we're going to do away with money. We're ready for this, and everyone's on board, with a few little kind of maybe remainders who are just antiquated, and that. But being ready for the next phase of consciousness's evolution is actually really messy. And I think even in my email to you, I mentioned that the feeling is more to me like an agrarian tribe who, based on a bunch of environmental factors, is actually making the very difficult, or coming to the difficult conclusion that maybe they need to be nomadic, and actually change their way of life. And that would not be a smooth. That would be more, that wouldn't be a smooth thing. Does that kind of make sense? And how do you see the need for evolution right now of consciousness?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a number of things. I think part of the reason why there's such a fascination for the past and the deep past, whether it be, the way that I know objects from ancient Egypt fill up the galleries of the world, and we walk through the Egyptian galleries and are completely transfixed by them. At some level, they're speaking to us of an awareness that we've largely lost, and that it compels us, it draws us to want to know what that's about. Or conversely, the way that there's fascination with indigenous cultures. It's partly because of the desperate state that these people find themselves in, and concern about that, of course. But at the same time, I think part of the fascination is that they clearly engage with the world with a nuance and a sophistication that, again, is being lost to us. We have a mobile phone that's got its own nuance and sophistication, but they can listen to the wind in the trees and expect a kind of nuance and sophistication, a whole ecology of being, I think, that is largely lost to us for all the achievements of science. So I think that, watching where people are drawn, this is again like the soul of words, where the energy is taking us. And Barfield thought that poetry works, for example, not because just that it puts words together in a clever way, but the putting the words together in a unique way releases a kind of energy that the words can channel. This is part of their facet of having soul. And similarly, to sort of try and follow the energy in life. Again, the religious Christian way of putting it would be to follow the spirit, and that will take us somewhere. But you've got to do the work. You've got to kind of make it something of your own in order to stay yourself on this path and not just get kind of blasted like a psychedelic trip. A psychedelic trip might open your mind to more than you ever thought, but at the end of the day, you have to come round and try and live a life, right? And make it part of you, and that's the real task, both individually and culturally, I think.
Yeah, you have to take something away and create at least a few, create a little bit of a future in front of your face that you can move towards, that you want to move towards, that calls to you in some way. So yeah, do you have a theory about what the next evolution of consciousness will be? Like, do you have uh, is it a return to religious thinking, or is it what? How do you view the next 1,000 years, or is that too?
Yeah, the quick answer, I don't know.
Of course.
Um, uh, I mean, I think something is afoot now, and at the end of the day, you try and make something yourself, and with the groups of people you find, and you do things like podcasts or write books and so on, to try and deepen the sense of it. I mean, one thing I think is really important for us in a materialistic age is to always remember that heaven is not a place on earth. And the minute where you try to build heaven on earth, you end up building tyrannies. And again, a kind of more expanded consciousness realizes that the material life we lead is just one aspect of a much, much broader life. And most, I feel most humans for most of history have had quite a keen awareness that this life is just one aspect of the life that we live. It's got its own tasks, if you like. I think particularly to become more individual, to take more responsibility, to learn more what freedom's about, to develop capacities and virtues that enable you to experience and see more and more of reality. And that would be my sense of what this life is about. But at the end of the day, this life will die. There's no doubt about that. But again, in any spiritual tradition of real sophistication, that is there. I mentioned Blake earlier on. One of Blake's characters, Loss, goes around with his kind of hammer and tongs and his anvil and his furnaces, constantly trying to build Golgonooza, as he puts it. But whenever there's the kind of apotheosis moment in Blake, Golgonooza goes, in fact. And Loss's effort is not actually in what he's built, but it's what he's found out about himself in the attempt to build it. So I think that, the more important thing is that we do take this life seriously, but we're also prepared to kind of let it go as well, because the fruits of this life are actually, found elsewhere, I think.
Well, that's a great answer, and the reason I like that answer is that it's more about a way of moving. It's more about a way of perceiving than it is about a utopian future, and I think that's kind of what we need. Like even in the fact that one of the things that's interesting in your book was that it talks about the biblical canon being created over a long period. I can't remember the exact number of years, but over quite a long
period. Three centuries, say, something like that.
Yeah. I always thought of that as a annoying thought, especially as I was trying to defend this faith that was so supposed to be so coherent, and so like no contradictions and that kind of thing. So I guess that it seems like what you're describing is that we move towards a future that is both sought and revealed at the same time. That there is that we move forward in faith towards a better future, while we kind of imagine what that future might be as we go, and let that imagination of the future grow and change as we move. And I don't know. I'm just rephrasing, not really asking a question.
Yeah, no. I mean, texts. The meaning is not actually on the page. The meaning emerges when you engage and read from the page. That's where it comes back to life again. So fundamentalism, if that means the Bible is kind of inerrant via the words on the page, is, to my mind, just misunderstands reading.
Right.
No one actually does that. You have to interpret the words to read and make something of them. And I mean, the other aspect of it, maybe this is more overtly it's more overtly theistic or a question of faith, that I think we live in an open system universe, not a closed system. It's not at the end of the day, it's not actually up to us to make something of the future. The future has its own energy, its own life. Our question is, whether we want to go with it and try and amplify it and expand it. And that's both wonderful. It's a challenge, and it has its ups and downs, but it's also a bit relaxing. I feel that maybe quite a lot of our problems these days would just depressurize somewhat if we had faith in life itself, rather than again, I think it comes from the machine model that we somehow have to make it all ourselves, and if we don't make it all ourselves, then the whole thing falls apart.
Right. Yeah, no, that's true. And so, I really do appreciate how non-prescriptive all this is, and how it's rather framing the fact that we do evolve. It's not even a question of we must take the reins and now evolve. It's that we do evolve. The one thing I would take away that it feels a bit prescriptive, or one thing I would like to encourage in the world is that people really grapple with the definition of imagination and creativity, and that everyone take within themselves the duty, but also the joy and the just the universality of the creative act and of imagination, and the fact that it's not something you got to go learn to do. It's something you're doing now, and being aware of it and forming a relationship with it is going to make your life better, or at least make your inner life, better.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
No, I mean, I completely agree with you, and sort of to demystify or whatever it takes imagination, that by, as it were, getting up in the morning and experiencing the day in the way that you experience it, whether you love the sun or hate the rain, whatever it might be, that is an imaginative act.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just one spontaneous thing that's come up in the moment. It's got a backstory. It's kind of emerged over time. But if it's emerged over time, it means that it can shift into the future. And the way you use words, if you're an artist, the way you use the medium of your art, if you're a parent, the way you relate to your children, all these things come out of this capacity we have to not just be robots, essentially, but to change, to have some sort of degree of freedom, to react and so on and respond.
Yeah. Yes, and to not create a firm and settled and final conclusion about what life is now, and not to enforce what the future must be, to let life live and live it imaginatively. It feels like that's kind of what I take from the book, and like I know it's what the Romantics were doing very successfully, but I also know that a lot of people will not, may never reach a point in their lives where they can sit down with that romantic poetry, and it will move them in the way that something else might, or I guess something nonverbal. So I just want to affirm that while words have a soul, words are really revealing a soul that is kind of a wordless thing, and so that someone else may experience that soul through craftsmanship or through other experiences of life, and it doesn't need to be limited to.
Yeah, no, for sure. The beauty of nature, the kinds of things which people have their different takes on things. Different kinds of music, for example, doesn't have to be one sort of music.
Mm-hmm.
So many different kinds of words. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that feels like a good spot. We've been going for an hour. This has been really enjoyable. And I really appreciate your book. So thank you for writing it.
Yeah, well, look, thank you for picking it up, because it kind of comes out of my heart and wrestling and so on. And so it's really tremendous when it connects. That's all about kind of participating in it. And, if you want to talk again, then please do be in touch.
Absolutely.
I hope that, a bit like Barfield's ideas serving some greater reality, I hope that what I try and put down connects with others, has a kind of, unfolds things further down the line.
Yeah.
So please be back in touch.
Thank you. Yes, I think I will. I would like to actually get into, you've got quite a lot of work around Dante's Inferno. And that's something that is a whole world that I have just sampled so far, and I might want to talk about that at some point. So if you're open to that, then I'll be.
No, for sure. Yeah, no, I'm doing this podcast, which is a canto by canto trot through Dante's Divine Comedy, the Inferno, the Purgatory, and the Paradise.
Yeah.
And the idea is, again, this is a transformative text. It works on you. It changes your experience. So, and it's the 700th anniversary of the Paradise, the last part this year, and then next year is the 700th anniversary of Dante's death. So it's kind of a good time to do it as well.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's something that there is a bit of the language of it can be a bit prohibitive and all the symbolism. So it's really cool that you can kind of unpack that. So yeah, I would love to delve a bit more into that and then talk to you about that. And yeah. So thank you so much for being on the show. And if nothing else, I was going to say, if nothing else, take away from this that your work is hitting people and resonating and yeah, much appreciated.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much too. Cheers.
Okay.